Thank you all very much for bearing with us for this day-long deep dive into uh, current policy thinking around the future of peacekeeping and the peace-building architecture review. I'm particularly grateful for Ambassador Harold for bearing with us. He stepped out earlier, as you noticed, because of the session of the Peace and Security Council that was happening earlier today, which was focusing on de-radicalization in the context of the terrorism menace that many parts of the continent are facing today. I'm very pleased to welcome now to the podium, to the high table, Your Excellency Ambassador Harold, Your Excellency El Simwan, Your Excellency Ambassador Fred, Your Excellency David. David, you are excellent. Huh? Why are you reluctant? He's reluctant, you know. Okay, so this session basically brings the two discussions we have had so far, the peacekeeping and peace building conversations that we have had so far. But it narrows it down to the relationship between the United Nations and the African Union. Perhaps a partnership that have shaped a great deal in terms of what has been said early in the morning. The innovations, change surrounding generations of peacekeeping. This is also where we have experienced earlier on during the break. One was explaining the background to the adoption of the peace building, the post construction and PCRD, post conflict reconstruction and development policy that was adopted in 2006, what the ideas and the background behind that was. I will not really take a lot of time in this respect, would rather give the floor to members of the panel. I would like to start with Your Excellency Ambassador Harold, who is a member of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, and who has a unique position in that Sierra Leone is the only country that is a member of both the Peace and Security Council and the UN Security Council, really showing incredible leadership in the UN Security Council in projecting Africa's voice, but also in terms of its interventions and coordination with other members of the Africa's 3+ members of the African Union. And here, of course, he will also bring, as mentioned, Sierra Leone's own experience in terms of the role of the UN, but also that of the African Union. Ambassador, most welcome, please.
Good afternoon, distinguished guests. Let me preface my remarks by thanking Dr. Solomon Dasso and Amani Africa for extending this invitation to us to take part in this panel discussion. Of course, this is the second time in the last few months when we've had to receive invitation from Amani Africa to take part in discussion that borders on Africa's role in global affairs. During that time, we discussed the reform of the UN Security Council. As you know, Sierra Leone is a member of the UN Security Council in a non-permanent category, We are also part of the AU, African Union Peace and Security Council. In the interest of full disclosure, I come and take part in this discussion as ambassador of a country that is the product of what I want to call collaborative peacekeeping. Collaborative in the sense that when those of you who can remember very well in the 1990s, when Liberia first and then Sierra Leone sank into turmoil, it was during that time, previously, when the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, they had a doctrine of non-interference. But as both countries sank into turmoil, the duty to intervene kicked in, first led by ECOWAS under the intervention force called ECOMOG. They actually went in, so to speak, to pick out the cashew nut from the fire. So it was a question of peace enforcement. So they went in, and then both Liberia and Sierra Leone, over a period of time, with the blessing of the United Nations, they were able to come in and try to pacify the situation. Today, both countries have had successive elections. The authority of states have been restored in both Liberia and Sierra Leone. So we feel we come to this discussion with that at the back of our mind, that we are beneficiaries of what I want to call that collaborative peacekeeping. I suppose one can say that was the golden age of our peacekeeping, if you can follow me, because then the United Nations, even to some extent, the United States was on board. That was how we were able to win over our peace. So these types of engagements are crucially important in order for our continent not just to be at breast with events, but also to help shape how we move. But distinguished guests, at a time when there is an assault on multilateralism on all fronts, when there is an apparent retreat from global leadership, from those who have traditionally been at the vanguard of rules-based system, this continent, Africa, has suddenly been jolted into action to embark on her own rescue mission. This assault on multilateralism is not just from the now familiar suspect. Even countries that have traditionally been viewed as rock-solid believers in global solidarity have decided to look inwards. We see not only the attack on overseas development aid, for example, to fund Europe's own defense, we also see the emergence of new global order, characterized by the concept of transactional relations, where the value and importance of nations are determined not by rules-based order, but by the value of the quantum or real earth minerals. Into this uncertain world, Africa finds itself also trapped, where conflicts continue to mushroom, despite our declared aim of silencing the guns. There is therefore the imperative need for a new thinking for this continent to come up with bold and imaginative thinking. So as we prepare for the 2025 Berlin Peacekeeping Ministerial, we must recognize that Africa as both a beneficiary and key stakeholder in global peacekeeping. Global peacekeeping efforts has a pivotal role to play in shaping the future of peace operations. Africa's deep and multifaceted engagement with peacekeeping and peace building is incontrovertible. The continent hosts the largest number of UN peacekeeping missions and has pioneered regional peace initiatives through the African Union. Regional economic communities and bilateral engagements. Yet, our role must go beyond being recipients of peace operations. We must become architects of their design, implementation, and evolution. Africa's peace and security landscape has demonstrated that traditional peacekeeping models originally designed for interstate conflicts are increasingly inadequate in addressing today's multidimensional threats. The nexus between peacekeeping and peacebuilding, including the roles of governance, development, and regional security structures, must be at the heart of our collective approach. Distinguished guests, allow me at this point to touch on the linkages or interlinkages on strengthening peacekeeping through African solutions, which include inter alia. One, peacekeeping and peacebuilding are not separate endeavors. They are two sides of the same coin. Africa has taught the world that peacekeeping operations must prioritize stabilization, governance support, and institution building to prevent relapse into conflicts. The African Union's post-conflict reconstruction and development policy exemplifies this integrated approach, and it must inform global peacekeeping reforms. The African Union, Peacekeeping and Security Council, and the regional mechanisms such as ECOWAS, IGAD, and SADC, and others have shown leadership in conflict mediation, rapid response, and long-term peace strategies. Initiatives such as AMISOM in Somalia, now awesome in the next few weeks or so, and the G5 Joint Force and ECOWAS-led responses in West Africa highlights the importance of African-led solutions. These must not only be supported financially and logistically, but also institutionalized as core components of UN peacekeeping components. Sustainable peacekeeping requires sustainable financing. The debate over UN assets contribution for African-led peace support operations remains unresolved. Yet adequate, predictable, and sustainable funding is crucial. The African Union's Peace Fund is a commendable initiative, but international partners must complement these efforts through mechanisms that ensure timely, reliable, and non-conditional support. The 2025 Berlin Ministerial must advance concrete commitments on this issue. The future of peacekeeping demands greater inclusivity. Africa's youthful population is an untapped resource for peace, and their participation must be enhanced in peacekeeping missions, local peace initiatives, and decision-making processes. Similarly, the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security must move from rhetoric to practical, measurable progress. African women leaders and grassroots organizations are already driving peace building. This must be recognized and institutionalized in global frameworks. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, for African perspectives to shape the next generation of peacekeeping and peace building, we must enhance strategic partnerships, representation, and knowledge sharing at multiple levels. In doing so, we must undertake the following. One, Africa must secure a stronger voice in the UN Security Council deliberations on peacekeeping mandates. African leadership in UN missions, including at the force commander and civilian leadership levels, must increase. Regular UN, AU-UN consultations must be strengthened to ensure that African priorities are reflected in global peacekeeping strategies. South-South cooperation and knowledge sharing should be expanded to expand best practices from African-led peace initiatives. Distinguished guests, the 2025 Berlin Peacekeeping Ministerial offers an opportunity to reshape global peacekeeping policies, not just for Africa, but with Africa as an equal partner and equal contributor. The interlinkages between peacekeeping and peace building, the role of regional African mechanisms, the necessity of sustainable financing, and the evolution of peacekeeping mandates must be central to these discussions. Africa is not just a theater of conflict, it is a hub of solutions, innovations, and reliance on resilience. By ensuring complementarity between African-led initiatives and global peace frameworks, we can move towards a more effective, inclusive, and sustainable approach to peacekeeping and peace building. Distinguished guests, let us seize this moment to build partnerships that reflect Africa's realities, aspirations, and leadership in shaping the next generation of peacekeeping. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think the point that you have made about the current assault on multilateralism requiring new thinking for Africa, potentially the need for reinvigorating investment in and support for the African Union and its architecture, and the possibility of it requiring greater responsibility, even on the part of member states of the African Union. I think there is something that needs to be borne in mind in that respect. And your point about Africa is not just a theater for conflict, but it is a hub of solutions and innovations. I think it's a very important point that we often forget and do not put to the foreground. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that. I come now to you, Ambassador Freight. Thank you for joining us. I know that you were in a meeting in the office of the African Union Commission. There was a question posed earlier that concerns you. You can address that question in the context of how do you imagine and envisage AU-UN relationship in the context of the future of peacekeeping, and what do you imagine or envisage the relationship of the AU and the UN to be in the context of the peacebuilding architecture review? Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Solomon. It's always an honor to be here with many distinguished speakers, especially after the eloquent speech by the ambassador of Sierra Leone. And I'm also happy to be here with actually my former boss and mentor, Gassim Wan. So it can be intimidating when you have people who have taught you many things to speak when they're next to you. But I'm also happy to have David here. A few things I would like to point out. Number one, what is the lay of the land when it comes to peacekeeping today? First, we see, I was reflecting while coming here, and I was thinking about a conversation that I heard the other day on the news that the AU Peace Support Operation deployed in Somalia about 18 years ago. We transitioned from AMISOM to ATMIS, now to AWESOM. But where are we today in Somalia? Al-Shabaab is on the verge of, they have increased attacks, let me say, on the capital, even had an assassination attempt yesterday on the president. I reflected on MONUSCO in the DR Congo. Since 1994, they've been there. And what do we have? We still have rebels who are able to overrun MONUSCO, overrun SAMI DRC, and many forces in that country. So, and I can go on and on an example. We've been all following the situation in South Sudan, where we have United Nations mission in South Sudan, where the White Army is mobilizing in Upper Nile, and where they even shot actually at the UN helicopter. So the question I ask myself is, what has gone wrong with the current model? Let's park that there for one moment. Then we have the coalition of the willing, where we have, for example, the example of the MNJTF, which actually has been doing well, but they have an anchor state which actually has been helping, which is Nigeria. We now have this alliance, IOS, still to see. The jury is still out there. So we're having many coalition, many alliances that are being born that we need to look at, more carefully and to understand what's happening with them. What is interesting is that they're able to fund their own operations. Of course, they don't have the limits that we have with regards to compliance to international frameworks, on compliance framework, human rights, and so on and so forth. But then you also had a situation where we had hybrid missions like in Darfur and so on and so forth. And we saw what happened there. But we have an interesting, actually, new phenomenon, which I think, and I believe actually we'll be seeing more and more of these. It's bilateral arrangements, which are actually supported by the AU Peace and Security Council, and which get international support. So countries get together, they agree on an arrangement. There is rapid deployment, they get all that support, and then you are able to get the support. Here I'm thinking about the case of Rwanda and the Mozambican forces in Cabo Delgado province, where they came to the AU Peace and Security Council. They received the endorsement, and then were able actually to tap into the European Peace Facility. So these are some of the models of things that we're seeing out there. That's the lay of the land. So I want to reflect and say what went wrong, because quite frankly, when you look at it, we have made progress, but we have a lot of challenges actually, whether it's in Somalia, whether it's in the DRC. Today in the DRC, the right number of armed groups is at 262. I know that everybody talks about AFCM 23, but there's about 262 armed groups in that country. And yet MONUSCO has been there since 1994. So why have they not been able to stop these armed groups or the killings? Of course, it's much more complex, but I'm just saying that something has gone wrong. And when I think about it, where we get it wrong, and Somalia also that's another case, it's because a peacekeeping mission or a peace support operation is deployed to create the right environment for the stakeholders to address their issues. They're not deployed there to sort out the issues. In other words, we should put first and foremost the primacy of politics. If you look into all these countries, what has gone wrong is that we have not put forward the primacy of politics. I worked in Somalia, and this was from 2008 to 2014. At that time, we were talking about finalizing the constitution, because that country struggled to figure out whether they wanted a federal state, whether they wanted a centralized system, or whether they wanted separation, which is actually a challenge that exists here. When you look at the governance issues that exist also in the DRC, it came back to haunt us because we didn't address issues which are like national reconciliation. I know it sounds so cliche, but it is important. Issues like accountability and transitional justice. Issues like institutional capacity, building the capacity of the state. In some of these countries, we only have the state in name, but the institutions are not there, or institutions don't know how to work together. And even the smart partnerships that we talk about, they would like to say that everybody talks about coordination, but no one wants to be coordinated. I remember one time President Obasanjo said something along the line of, I don't mind many cooks in the kitchen so long as there's a chef. So the point I'm trying to make here is, for us, the AU and the UN going forward, whatever we're going to be working on, instead, we get caught up sometimes in our own bureaucratic lingo, but we need to really get back to the basic. Focus first primarily on the politics, restore real diplomacy. When I say restore real diplomacy, I'm talking about back-channel diplomacy, focus on reconciliation, accountability, institutional capacity, and smart partnerships. That will make our peace support operations and our peacekeeping model, or whatever mechanism we put in place, much easier and much more likely to succeed. I would like to say that the good news is, when it comes to the UN Secretariat and the AU Secretariat, we're doing very well. We have our regular clusters meetings, that's at the desk officers level. We have our desk-to-desk meetings where we bring in also the RECs. Now we're trying to bring in other new UN agencies. We have our joint task force meeting, which is at the USG level, commissioner levels. We have our annual conference level, which is at the SG levels. And so we are doing well as institutions. I'm not so sure about our AU Peace and Security Council and our UN Security Council, but there is regular consultations, and that's already a positive sign. The reality is that we live in a new world, and the only thing that is predictable is that there is unpredictability. And this also applies to, I know that many people have been talking about 2719. Many are saying, oh, you know what, it's dead with this new administration in Washington. But we must be found ready. I mean, we as in the AU and the UN, we must be found ready. We must make sure that the reports that have been requested of us are ready and that we submit them on time to the Security Council. Here, I would like to take this opportunity to inform you that we've been working this whole month, actually. We've been having different meetings. As you know, some of you, we have 4 work streams that are working. The first work stream is joint planning, reporting, and decision making. Basically, it's the process through which you trigger 2719. And we have actually finalized the planning guidelines, which will be part of the readiness report, which is due, I believe it's on the 1st of May. And then for the Security Council to be able to make a decision on it. We have the mission support work stream as well, looking at how basically this mission will be supported. We've been looking at financing and budgeting and the compliance and protection of civilians. These are the 4 work streams that we have, and we've been making sure that on all those 4 work streams, we'll be ready to have them in the 2719 readiness report so that the council can decide. We have also decided that we need to separate 2719 from specific cases, because if you go, for example, and say 2719 for Somalia, you will have people who feel uncomfortable and not be able to consider it. But for us, as far as we're concerned, we're making sure that these reports are ready and that the council will have the choice to decide based on the prevailing situation on the ground. As a matter of fact, as I speak to you right now, we also have Maman Sidiku, who's in town, and he's actually finalizing his report on UNSOS, the ISR report on UNSOS. They are reviewing UNSOS as well, so that they can, all this will facilitate the decision-making process for the UN Security Council to decide on whether 2719 can be applied to, we would like Somalia because that's the emergency for us. Then we have also, and I think this, you will hear this in the coming days, we're going to be organizing a donor conference to look into funding the 25%. As you know, the resolution 2719 has, it's up to 75%, but the AU must come up with 25%. So we're looking at that, but also to be able to look at the arrears that we have with ATMIS. We are today, as I speak to you, every month since the new mission has started, it's about $12 million. And here I'm talking about stipends. I'm not even talking about logistics. So $12 million times 3, by now we're almost $36 million in debt in stipends. ATMIS, the past one, it was $94 million. So you can imagine, these are very, very costly missions. And the reality is that in the new world, Europe is shrinking its budget. They're looking more into their defense. You know, the US administration, the jury is still up in the air. It will all depend on the Congress. They've already started signaling that they don't believe in peacekeeping. So this is the context in which we are in. But for us, we are making sure that we're not caught up, not ready. We want to make sure that we are ready to deliver what the Security Council requires of us. And that, quite frankly, we have also honest conversations. There are new players now, and these new players, we also need to engage them. They seem to be invested in peace. Today with some colleagues, we were discussing how much we've been seeing an increasing role of middle powers. But I've been looking at many communiques, whether it was on Somalia and Ethiopia, or whether it's on the DRC and Rwanda. When you look at the communique in there, they always refer to already existing African initiatives. So I believe that there is room for us to engage with these middle powers and build a consensus on the way forward, taking into account the new realities of this world. The rest, I think the ambassador said it so eloquently, so I'll just stop here so that we can continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Freid. It's difficult to summarize the many points that you have made, so I will not attempt to do that. Instead, I will pass on the floor to Juan, and I think from a practical perspective, I don't think that I need to pose the question to you, but from a perspective of, I think, the relationship between the UN and the African Union, which has been institutionalized through various processes. How do we go from where we are today into the future as we think and plan about the future of peacekeeping and peace building? Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Solomon, and thanks to the Ambassador of Sierra Leone, and Fred as well, for the excellent presentations. I would like to be practical in the context of the AU-UN relation in peace and security, and trying to link peace building and peacekeeping. And the linkage for me is governance. Because the reality is, when you look at the situation in Africa, years back, but also currently, our issues are fundamentally issues of governance. And when I say governance, I'm not referring to governance as we understand it being liberal systems with multi-party politics and so on. I'm referring to the ability of the state to keep its bargain on the social contract. Means to deliver basic services, including ensuring security, and to ensure that the resources collected on behalf of the citizenry are by and large well used or effectively used. And this does not mean that you don't have corruption. You have corruption everywhere in the world, and you can have a sizable level of corruption, but still have a delivery of basic services. It is possible to do so. So, and when I look at even the most serious crisis in Africa, I take in the Sahel, but Somalia as well, or Congo, I think people refer to it today. Basically, these are crises of governance where the state has not been able to keep its bargain, its side of the bargain with the citizenry. How do we resolve it? And I think the peace-building architecture review, at least as far as the African content is concerned, is basically about that, is how do we improve governance? If we improve governance, security will improve, stability will improve. Now, luckily, in the context of the African Union, we have fantastic instruments that have been developed over the past, I would say, 25 years. And just in passing, to mention, because often there is a tendency to create a dichotomy between the OAU and the AU. OAU was a club of dictators. AU is the embodiment of democracy, which does not tally with reality. The reality is the overwhelming majority of the AU instruments, the far-reaching instruments, were developed during the OAU time. In fact, the turning point for Africa was not 2000 when the AU was launched, was 1990 when Salim Ahmed Salim submitted his report on fundamental changes taking place in the world and their consequences for Africa, and the head of state adopted a declaration on the matter. And it was on that basis that you had the Abuja Treaty, on that basis that you had the declaration, the Cairo Declaration, which later on evolved into the PAC Protocol, and so on and so on. So I think Africa has developed fantastic instruments. I don't need to list them, but maybe it's useful for people just to have few. Of course, we refer to the Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, excellent instrument, developed in 2007, I think entered into force in 2012. But I could list two other less known charters. There is a charter on local service and, a charter on local administration. And then there is another charter on civil service and public administration. Excellent tools, which are complementary to the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. I could refer to the 2003 Convention on Combating and Preventing Corruption, the Protocol on Women, 2003, Maputo, excellent tools, forward-looking, the PAC Protocol, of course, APRM, NEPAD, of course, the institutions, the commission in Banjul, created in the 80s, the court in Arusha, the anti-corruption board in Arusha as well, and so on. So we have the tools. Our challenge is implementation. And the implementation challenges are partly linked to resources at the level of the AU, expertise, and of course, political will. But again, political will does not drop from the sky. Political will has to be created, and there are ways of creating political will. So, how do we engage, therefore, on those issues of governance? And my point is, we need to build a forward-looking and strong and practical, I insist on the practical, partnership between the AU and the UN. And why it is important to do so? Because conversations around governance are extremely sensitive. And no African government will take kindly to be lectured on governance issues by outside powers, especially now. It was difficult then. It's even more difficult today in the current context in Africa. I think that period has passed. And African countries are not always wrong to be sensitive, because obviously conversations around governance can also be the cover to interfere in domestic affairs. So we need to find a way of combining the AU legitimacy, because all those values on governance we're talking about have been adopted, endorsed by Africans within the context of the AU. So they have a legitimacy, and the AU has an entry point. We should combine that legitimacy of the AU with the technical expertise and resources of the UN. How do we combine the two and move forward? I think that's the challenge, and that's where the AU and the UN should work. Now, what can they do in practical terms? Three things in my view. Point number one, those commitments taken by African countries need to be implemented at national level. Obviously, partly you have political challenges linked to political will. Partly you have technical challenges that may be 40% of the issue. How could the AU and the UN work together to help countries develop national action plan to implement the AU instruments on governance, and then accompany them, technically financing? And the conversation would no longer be to dictate to African countries what they need to do, but rather to help them implement what they have adopted themselves within an African framework, in this case, the African Union. I think that's point number one. And we can build on existing AU instruments, the PRM, of course, which comes up, but it's voluntary with action plans. We can build on the conflict, how to call it when we launch it, continental conflict prevention framework, which developed a conflict mitigation framework. We can build on that, and we can build on all the reporting requirements on human rights. The Charter on Democracy has a reporting requirement, the Convention on Corruption. And then see how to help countries develop national action plans. And believe me, the conversation would be different. It's no longer an imposition from the World Bank or IMF or policy preferences from Paris, Washington, or London, but rather how do we help African countries implement what they have decided in a sovereign fashion within the context of the EU. Point number two, how do we do dissemination? One of the challenges we have in Africa is that all these beautiful instruments, far-reaching instruments, are little known, even by our academics, not to speak of the grassroots organizations. And yet, the best way to hold African leaders and governments to account is to ensure that their citizenry is aware of the commitments made in conference halls and can challenge them, not on the basis, again, of policy preferences of pronouncement by non-African actors, but rather on the basis of commitments made by African leaders. And it makes a hell of a difference. Take Burkina Faso, 2014, or 30, I can't remember, 14, I believe, when then President Compaoré tried to extend his mandate for a third term, which was deemed illegal. People demonstrated. What did they take with them? The Charter, the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, to tell him you cannot do this because this is the commitment you have made in the context of the EU. Far more powerful than saying, oh, Paris is against or Washington is against. In the current context of sovereignty assertion, that discourse doesn't work. So we need to disseminate those tools so that African stakeholders can use them in their domestic struggle for freedom and for better governance. Point number three, AU and UN can work together to strengthen the role and the capacity of existing African institutions that are in charge of monitoring those instruments. I refer to the Commission on Human Rights. Solomon was the chair, and you still remember, am I correct? Okay, the Anti-Corruption Board in Arusha, APRM in Midrand, South Africa. I could refer to the Committee on the Right of Children. I think they're in Nairobi, from my understanding. And Lesotho, oh, okay, yeah, they moved, yeah. Oh, yeah, but they were in Nairobi initially, then they moved to Lesotho. But you see, I left the EU a while ago, so I've not updated my software. So help those institutions play their role. And again here, you will be surprised. You know, one of the reports, at least from my time at the AU, but you correct me, you and Fred, that is the most discussed when the Executive Council meet, is the report of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Why? Because African countries don't want to be mentioned in that report. Because when you are mentioned in that report, you can't accuse the imperialists, the colonialists, the neo-imperialists of trying to run a hidden agenda. This is done by an African institution. You can't challenge it and dismiss it out of hand. So let's help those institutions perform their role. And the African Commission does a fantastic work. I'm not doing it because Solomon is my brother, but I have followed their work. The African Court, and people don't hear about it, does a wonderful job. Most of their rulings are rulings, in fact, that even run against claims by African countries, in fact. And I could give you examples. There was a ruling on Cote d'Ivoire on the Electoral Commission. There was a ruling on Burkina Faso. They were ruling on Tanzania. And I could list many of them. There are few articles about the work of the court, but people don't talk about it. APRM does a fantastic job in looking at governance issues in our countries. In Kenya, they did predict what happened in 2008, but obviously those institutions need to be supported to do their work. So basically, my point is governance is sensitive. Africans will not take it kindly to be lectured on governance by outsiders, and I can understand why they will not take it kindly. And governance anyway will only work if it is domesticated and owned nationally and locally. AU has the right instrument and the right institutions. Let the AU and the UN join efforts so that the UN expertise and resources can be used to building on the legitimacy of the African Union, which has the entry points and all the tools necessary to have those conversations with member states. My second point, and quickly I conclude on that, on peacekeeping. What can be done? I did make few points on this early on. Basically, my point is this. Obviously, as I said, AU peace operations and UN peace operations are closely interrelated. The success of one strengthens the other. The failure of one weakens both organizations. So none would succeed at the expense of the other. And AU peacekeeping to succeed or peace support operations need UN support. Somalia is a case in point. There will be no AMISOM without the UN support package, period, as simple as that. But UN operations, and I speak as someone who led one of the largest and probably the most complex UN operation, MINUSMA, cannot succeed without the support of the AU. And it's a conversation, a point that is lost on many people. And I will explain why. One, regional organizations, AU or sub-regional entities or neighboring countries often are the ones leading the political processes that UN peacekeeping operations are meant to support. In the case of Mali, we were mandated to support the Algiers Agreement, but Algeria was in the lead. And to support the restoration of constitutional rule, ECOWAS was on the lead. Our role was to support post-processes. So the extent to which the UN succeed depends on the extent to which those African lead of those peace processes fulfill their roles. I think there is a very close and interrelated process. So it means what? For UN mission to succeed, they should enjoy full support by the AU. The AU should own them as if it was its own missions, as if it was its own mission, which is not the case currently. And I explain how it could work. One, Africans need to use any leverage they have vis-a-vis the host countries, the conflicting parties to advance the peace process. They can do it more effectively. We don't have time to go into the details. Second, Africa should be in the lead in raising issues when those missions are confronted with challenges in the field. Again, from my own experience in New York when I was ASG, in Mali when I was SRSG, missions face huge challenges. You want to investigate human rights, you're blocked. You want to move from one place to the other, you suffer from freedom of movement. And there are a number of other constraints facing not only our mission in Mali, but a number of other UN missions. But when those issues arose, only often the P3 or few other countries raise them. African countries hardly speak about them, even though most of the troops are Africans. And yet, if MINUSMA or UNMISS in South Sudan, MINUSCA in CAR succeed, it's good for Africa. It's good for the country. It means what? It means the AU has to create the conditions for those missions to succeed. And the AU should be in the lead in raising issues when missions are confronted with challenges. Don't let those issues monopolized by the P3. Why? Because when the P3 raise them in the council, it automatically triggers a reaction from other member states in the context of the global geopolitics. And we lose sight of the real issue, and the whole mission is taken hostage of much larger issues that are not always how to put it, that can complicate efforts to restore peace on the African continent. And I have seen it in Mali firsthand. We had challenges on freedom of movement. We had other challenges, but those issues were only raised by the P3. And as a result, whenever I go to the council, it's a shouting match between the P3 and other members of the council. And we don't speak about the issue. It's lost in the global conversation about geopolitics. And yet, had MINUSMA succeeded, it would have been good for Mali, good for West Africa, good for Sahel, and good for the EU. How practically could we do it? It required two things. One, and I'm certain it's not done properly, at least I know even when I was in Mali, the UN has to keep the AU and regional mechanisms totally, completely informed of what missions are doing in the field, the problems they are confronting. I'm sure you never receive reports on freedom of movement challenges and other challenges facing UN missions on the ground. Because how could the AU take up those issues if the PSC and others are not properly informed? So you should engage the AU as a true partner and keep the AU fully informed and its regional mechanism of challenges, of activities by UN missions so that they know what's going on. And second, the AU has to play its role, one, by engaging conflicting parties, host countries, but also through the Security Council by taking the lead in supporting UN missions so that issues are not caught hostage of the global geopolitics. And one practical recommendation maybe the EU should look at, and the UN as well, why not, wherever you have a UN mission, have an AU liaison mission with that UN mission. That would make it possible to ensure that the AU is in the field. It looks at the mission as its own mission. It reports on its challenges and ensure that Addis can trigger action whenever issues are confronted in the field. And I can tell you, it's not a problem. In MINUSMA, we had a budget of $1.3 billion. $1.3 billion. Really supporting an AU mission of 10, 20, 30. That's not, I'm saying, it's absolutely peanut in the context of the mission. So there are ways of doing it. And by the way, in the past, we have done it. In Ethiopia, Eritrea, when UNMI, the UN mission, was deployed, we had an OU liaison mission to Ethiopia, Eritrea called OLMI. And in Western Sahara, what people forget often, MINURSO, we had an AU liaison office, which was funded by the UN. It was Ambassador Yilma, accommodated by the UN, per diems paid by the UN to ensure liaison with the UN. So I think we need to look at it a bit differently. But again, my bottom line is, AU should own UN missions as if they were its own missions, because when UN peacekeeping succeeds in Africa, it's good for Africa, it's good for the host country. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that very rich reflections from your side. One, I think the first point that you made is that we have to cast the net wide so that we do not, get caught up narrowly on the hard security, peace and security architecture of the African Union, that we need actually to be more inclusive of other aspects of the African Union institutions, norms and infrastructure. I think that's a very important point. And the importance of this is basically that the African Union and the UN then can be able to leverage these instruments and infrastructures of the African Union in their pursuit of implementing peacekeeping and implementing peace building, and as part of also enhancing their partnership, anchoring on what may be considered to be instruments to which member states have already subscribed freely and find themselves bound by in a situation where you can't blame anybody else for that these are your own things actually. And of course, I think the third point that you have made is basically peacekeeping operations, UN peacekeeping operations, I think in the discourse and narrative are seen as UN's responsibility. And UN is something outside of us. You know, we are not part of. I think there is that thinking that needs to be broken down. And what that requires is basically, for example, beyond and above what you said, in the annual consultative meeting between the PSC and the UN Security Council, are there ever any discussions about the challenge facing UN peacekeeping operations in Africa and how jointly to deal with those challenges? It has never featured on that. All right. So there are indeed many avenues to improve and work on in the context of AU-UN relationship about the role of peacekeeping and peace building operations. Now, Paul in the morning outlined the 30 models of peacekeeping. We are having a debate here in Africa and in the African Union about the future of, for example, AUSOM. But the debate is a debate about either you have AUSOM or you have nothing. And I wonder, in the light of these 30 models that are presented by the study, whether we should actually think about the future of AU mission in Somalia in those zero-sum terms. Either you have AUSOM in its current form, or you have nothing at all. Or should we think about this completely differently, having regard to the models, the 30 models that have been presented by the study? David, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Solomon. I think it's at that time where one has to exercise a bit of academic humility and modesty. Not least, we have among us people who've been heavily involved in the operationalization phase of the partnership itself. Ambassador Fred, Mr. Wan, but also Professor Paul Williams, who've written one of the very few initial articles on the partnership, peacekeeping partnership in the early 2010s and all of that, as well as the ambassador of Sierra Leone, which is in the thick of current discussion, a country that's at the thick of the discussion around the reform of the UN Security Council. So I'll start by recognizing that this is a partnership that has come really a long way, passed through different timelines. It has different dimensions, the political, the operational, the financial, and all of this needs to be taken care of when it comes to analyzing the partnership and its effectiveness and where to from here. And I think a strong argument can also be made that it is one of the most robust partnerships that the UN has with regional actors. I think the empirics backs us on this one. So I'll just limit my intervention to two aspects that are indicated in the guiding questions. The first one is in terms of the measures that are required to enhance the AU-UN policy engagement. I would agree to most of the things that has been said, but importantly, it's also important to establish or to reestablish the political support and consensus on some of the existing policies and strategies that underpin the partnerships. Whether in the areas of peacekeeping, whether in the areas of peace building, I think it's important to reestablish that political support for the existing instruments and in the wider sense. And it's also important, this is important because this helps us address the critical implementation challenge that has been emphasized in the morning. We have the norms, we have the institutions, we have the structures, but I think it's also important to take one step further to the implementation phase. The critical question that we have is in terms of how do we induce that big push to the AU and its member states to have that strong push in terms of going back to the implementation of all these things. We hear statistics that only 93% of the AU's decisions are implemented. So what is that big push required to get them to implementation level? Another point that we need to put into perspective is also the partnership also needs to shift its focus more to conflict prevention. And this has been recognized both by the UN and by the AU. The UN saying that as early as 2018 that conflict prevention is its weakest link. And the AU also similarly acknowledging the same, that the peacebuilding architecture remains the weakest link within APSA and AGA itself. So I think it's important to shift this focus to these aspects of the weakest link of the partnerships. Again, it goes without saying, adapting these frameworks, policies, and to current situation and critical challenges is very critical. So that's why we're much more interested as think tanks on the review of the UN peace operations as it currently happens, but also in terms of backing our own processes, such as the strategic review of the SF concept. On a more operational level, it's not always that the two organizations are on the same page when it comes to the analysis of critical security situation on the ground. So I think this calls a bit of an introspection in terms of what is required to be on the same level when it comes to the analysis of the crisis situation. And the second step with this one is that, yes, there might be instances where joint analysis exists, but also in terms of having the joint action is also very critical. So as a way of recommendation is, I think it's also important to have, now the partnership has reached to a current level. So a more frank and robust discussion of the partnership is required in terms of where to from here. And examining the various facets which have been mentioned so far. So this is more on the general recommendations, but just one final remark in terms of what kind of financing and political support is required for AU-led peace support operations. I think we can respond to these questions more concretely by taking the issue of 2017-19. So without losing sight of some of the implementation challenge, I think it's a microcosm that gives us a number of insights in terms of what can work and what could be the limitations. One is the importance of sustained engagement of the AU and the UN around some shared priorities and engagement. One. And secondly, also, the level of consultation that we've seen, especially in terms of the SG's report on financing. We as think tanks were involved, but we've also seen that there was a level of consultation and engagement with the African Union, which was very critical, but also around the new agenda for peace as well, where civil society was called upon to provide written inputs. And this is, I think, the way to go in terms of strengthening the various facets of the partnership, apart from what I mentioned earlier, namely to have a much more frank and robust discussion of the next stages of the partnership. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I think we now, after listening those very beautiful interventions, to use the word of Ambassador Schlapp, the question is, what is the future of AU-UN partnership on peace and security in the face of, to use your words, Ambassador, this enormous assault on multilateralism? What is the future of what is it that we need in the light of the bigger, I think, geopolitical context that we have? How do we basically salvage that partnership in this bigger context? These are questions that I think need to occupy our mind as we reflect on what the current state of the partnership is, and the issues that this partnership can engage in, the tools that this partnership can make use of, and indeed in some of the most immediate situations, including such as Somalia. The floor is open for your questions, reflections, and further comments, additions, interrogations, or contestations. Please.
Thanks very much to the panel for a very interesting set of. I don't have a good answer, but I'm going to respond to your point about the models and thinking about Somalia, and it is sort of a question as well. So I mean, look, I think in terms of your question about how do you respond and think about the UNAU partnership in our current situation, you've got two sets of issues. One is the future, and one is where we are now. And I think we've still got a dozen UN missions. We've got the Somalia mission. So I think the first part of the answer is let's make those current missions as good as they can be, which means the UNAU partnership has to focus on quite tactical, bureaucratic, technical, practical sets of issues. And as Fred said, the message seems to be one of genuine progress, if not complete success. And so we can pass that message back. But then we've got the next agenda, which is harder, is where is the next set of peace operations coming from, as we talked about this morning. And there you can look to Haiti, you can look to, potentially Gaza, potentially Sudan again, potentially Ukraine, potentially Myanmar, the list goes on. And that's where I think then we've got to come up with more creative and innovative ideas to sell the UNAU partnership to a skeptical, P2, or I mean, Russia and America in particular, I think, at the moment. And then on the specific question you asked about the models, so just remember, when we were designing the models, this is for a report on UN peace operations, so they're not meant to include war fighting as part of the models portfolio, which has obviously been the main event in Somalia. And secondly, they assumed as a result that the UN would deploy missions after there was either a ceasefire or a peace agreement. And of course, again, in Somalia, you don't have a ceasefire or a peace agreement. You've got a war. So with those two caveats, I would say, though, the models hopefully can provide a few insights, because I think it gives you that spectrum of options, right? Between, on the one hand, a mobile, really offensive enforcement type of force posture for AU SOM, or at the other end of the spectrum, the much more limited SSR military support and training to the SNA, maybe the Somali police force as well. And then elements like maritime security, still we've got an airport and a port to protect. Piracy issues may come back again. So yeah, I think the models you could dip into urban security issues, cultural heritage protection, civilian protection, you could debate those, but the main message is, the models weren't designed for a war fighting scenario. That's the problem.
Any other?
Yeah, thanks a lot for this really fruitful discussion, and also that now at least we can mirror these with the African Union side. So Ambassador Fred, more than welcome that you're here. Two issues. One thing is, at least from the partner perspective, I was attending with your side, Ambassador Fred, also in Nairobi, when we discussed on the APSA 5 to go forward, at least an implementation of all these policies, and to set priorities on top, to give us a chance at least to chip in and to support you by doing so. That is one part. So these things are running, and they are still active. Having a look right now that we do have the understanding for the whole day, and Dr. Solomon said these UN missions are there, and then the support for African Union. I think in the future we will shift at least to the other side, that missions are conducted and running at least by the African Union side, and support is more by the UN side, like we see in Somalia right now. But we still do have the misbalance, at least by the oversight mechanism, planning mechanism, and all over, like we have in New York, and which we have right now in Addis Ababa. Do you see at least a structural change then to bring you more in implementation? And is this welcome at least by the RECs and by your member states?
Any other? Okay. So we go back to the members of the panel. Okay. Ambassador.
Thank you, Dr. Solomon. I take my cue from your earlier question, and of course the esteemed guest as well. I think one thing that we have to remember is not to get caught up in mission creep. This is where even AU and in some cases the United Nations itself get entangled. If we go into a theater, if the mission is by all means to put a stop to the bloodletting, that should be the mission. In terms of building the nation or the nation building, that should be left with other people. But we must guard as far as possible against mission creep. That is my view.
Thank you, Ambassador. Juan? Do you want to have a parting shot or no?
On Paul's point, yes, we looked at UN peacekeeping, so we do not look at, let's say, missions such as AMISOM, but keep in mind in the modalities, I think it's modality 6, I can't remember, we refer to situations in which the UN delegate the deployment of an operation to a regional entity and possibly with some support. So it means, therefore, that should the Security Council determine it to be feasible and appropriate, it could very well delegate an organization, AU or coalition of member states or another regional entity to undertake peace enforcement and possibly with its own support. So it's not ruled out, but UN peacekeeping is obviously not meant as a war-fighting machine. And the last point is, I know that there is a lot of emphasis given the extent of the terrorist threat in Africa on peace enforcement missions of the type of AMISOM. Bottom line, though, is that let's not forget the politics. Even with a mandate as robust as that of AMISOM, you still need to go back to the politics because there is no military solution to those issues. So, and the distinction has to be, to some extent, nuanced, because I know in Mali, for instance, MINUSMA had a very robust mandate. The challenge was never the mandate as such, but obviously the capabilities and the level of cooperation with the Malians to implement that mandate. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I think you were asking me if we are planning to change our architecture to adjust to the new realities. Is that what I got? Well, today it's interesting because today we had a very interesting debate about AGA and APSA because now we're supposed to be under one roof. And how do we merge those two? And I remember in our conversation with the European Union, I think we've been now using the term GPS, governance, peace, and security, to capture both AGA and APSA, because governance is also linked to peace and security. I like what one was saying. I once heard someone saying that in many of our countries, we inherited administration. We didn't inherit states after colonialism. We inherited administrations, we didn't inherit states. So the challenge of this generation will be to create states which are responsive to the needs of their population. What he talked about, the bargain, I completely agree with him. With regards to the issue of there is something which is important. In Central African Republic in 2019, the model that one was talking about worked perfectly well. And that's how we were able to deliver the peace agreement of the Central African Republic. So the AU was in the lead. The UN provided expertise and logistical support. And we had other partners like ECAS, who were also with us, and the European Union. So by combining these efforts, we were able to not only exert pressure on the parties, but we brought 14 armed groups into Khartoum. Today, where they're fighting, that's where we actually brokered the peace agreement with the 14 armed groups. And then after we secured with that agreement, the UN actually brought its capabilities from Bangui, airlifted all of us. We were almost like 100 people if you include the armed groups and everybody else. And we went to Bangui to sign the agreement. So there has been some examples where this has worked. He was also talking about the idea of collocating in the same place. Today in Libya, We just recently signed actually an MOU with the Libyan authorities, allowing us actually to operate within the UN mission in Tripoli. So we will have our AU office there. So so these are things that have been done, which are important. But I would like to just, Solomon, if you allow me, very quickly to mention two things which are very important, because the context also of these peacekeeping matters. And one was talking about the primacy of politics. I started with that. Today, I'm seeing something that is very concerning globally. It's what we call the legitimization of political Salafism. The legitimization of political Salafism. We are making it normal with what we have seen in Afghanistan and Syria. And don't think that on this side of the continent, we don't have people who are watching and trying to emulate what has happened there. Today, when we talk about Somalia in the Middle Shabelle, one thing that we have noticed is that they're trying to train civil servants to run their administration while carrying out attacks. So their model is changing, and we are quite concerned, which is why we need to join efforts to really prevent this from happening. Second thing is the withdrawal from, let's say, USAID or even the shrinking envelope of our traditional partners is creating space which is actually being occupied by Wahhabists. What does that mean in actual fact? It means that the legitimization of the state. And these are things that we've seen before over and over again, but for some reason we don't learn. And it's something that I'm seeing. So this is important to mention here. One last point I would like to mention is that I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's a researcher in the US, and he told me the name of the game today, Fred, is one, securing maritime routes. Everybody wants to secure the Red Sea, wants to secure the Mediterranean, part of this global geopolitical competition. Two, it's critical minerals. I think back in the days, they used to hide it, but now it's very clear. They say it openly. The Lobito corridor, now even our own member states are also doing the same thing, but we're telling them, look, we have actually, did you know that we have the African Mineral Agency? We're telling them, protect yourself, protect your minerals, negotiate from a point of strength. Don't negotiate from a point of weakness. And lastly, they're still interested in terrorism. Despite what everybody says, the withdrawal. I think since President Trump, he has struck terrorist groups. He has struck in Al-Shabaab. They've struck also the Houthis. So we can have a conversation on all these issues. But I wanted to mention this because it's important to keep it in the back of your mind as we discuss these important issues on how we move forward as the AU and the UN. And the AU and the UN also, we should not be afraid of brainstorming and having this difficult conversation and say, hey, this is the world we are living in. How do we survive as multilateral entities? By the way, when I said the AU and the UN, I'm also including our RECs, because the other point I didn't mention to you is that we've seen, and the one, I don't know if you noticed it as well, is a tendency of our regional economic communities to compete with the continental body when it comes to peace and security. The reality is, when it comes to peace and security, that role was given to the AU as a continental body. There is a reason why our regional economic communities are called regional economic communities, because their number one mission was economic integration. Now we have even regional mechanism that we have added. I think it's NARC and the East African Standby Force, but we also have the ICGLR, which is asking to become a regional mechanism. So what we need to do is we need to rationalize also the way we work with our regional economic communities. It's getting better. We have our mid-year coordination summit, which is happening in Malabo. And we also now coordinate when we are trying to engage. For example, on the 21st of May, we will have the AU-EU ministerial meeting in Brussels. So we're trying to also see how we can harmonize our position when we are having a conversation with our partners. On peace building that he was mentioning, we are trying to develop a common African position. This is something that we've been actually trying to do. I think actually one played a major role in developing what they call a common defense position. But right now, many member states are asking us to develop a common African foreign policy. Because of course you have divergence of views, but at least to develop guiding principles, because we're in the G20, we're in the different forums, and we have to make sure that at least we have guiding principles which can guide us. I thank you so much. Sorry for being too long.
So that would be the last hand from Obi, from New Humanitarian.
I'm very sorry, just as everybody was wrapping up and about to go home. But two quick questions. One is perhaps we've been talking about what's the future of peacekeeping, but I'm also interested in what's the future of peacemaking. What does this, after the peacekeepers have done their thing, what is that peace look like? Because we've historically seen these elite bargains which quickly unravel. We're seeing what's happening in South Sudan again after years spent trying to fashion an agreement. We can see that unraveling. Is it the typical kind of UN peace agreement where you separate the two parties, you have elections, and then you leave, and you don't address the root causes of some of these problems? Secondly, on the issue of, particularly, I think, the Salafist issue, I think sometimes we tend to externalize this and see this purely as transnational movements, and we forget and don't appreciate the local roots of some of these problems. And really these kind of the ultimate slap in the face to our governments, which have failed to address grievances, have run unjust systems, and really, in a sense, these movements, be it Boko Haram or even Al-Shabaab, really are a response in some shape or form to those failures. And we also need to appreciate that they are also permeate our societies. In Al-Shabaab has every family, as far as I can work out in Sudan, in Somalia, has some relative in some distant or quite close relative in Al-Shabaab. These are not just simply groups that are foisted on our societies. They come from somewhere. And that needs to be recognized, I think, in terms of when we get to those peace agreements or peace negotiations, settlements need to include that dynamic as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Obi, for that last part actually in the special research report on terrorism that we did ahead of the Malabo summit. We indeed, one of the things that we said is that we tend to define the terrorism problem heavily in ideological terms, but the fundamentals are actually local. And the way we couched it was basically, it is the socioeconomic and political governance pathologies that create the vacuum that allow the emergence and expansion of these groups and these ills in society, rather than being purely and principally ideological. So that's really a very important point. But the question that he asked, will at the comment, anyone who'd like to respond to that? Yeah, the first question. Basically, what is the future of peacemaking? Mediation. We have been talking about the future of peacekeeping in the current context and the changing conflict situations and political dynamics. How about the future of peacemaking and mediation? Anyone who'd like to chip in here?
It's like I'm the one doing it now. Well, the fact of the matter is, and I don't want to sound like so cliche, but we need to really do things differently and bring an end to the conflicts. Today I was reading the report of Amani Africa, which, by the way, I highly recommend to all of you, about the number of crisis situations on the continent. In the AU, we have 55 member states. 23 are in crisis situation. Am I correct? 23. When you look at, and 23, I'm being nice because there are others which are coming. And when you look at what we have been doing, my mom likes to tell me, when you keep dancing on the right foot and it doesn't work, try the left. And the reality is that whatever we've been trying to do, the the normal diplomacy between us, it's not working, clearly. And this invocation of sovereignty, I keep reminding myself of, one was talking about 1990, about Ahmed Salim's report. But in 2002, when the AU was created, it was also, there were two principles. One was sovereignty is responsibility, and the other one was responsibility to protect, if I'm not mistaken. And we cannot be sitting here and watch situation unravel. We need to have teeth in our peacemaking effort. We need not to be afraid to sanction. We need to be. Someone was telling me, why is it that the European Union is fast to sanction parties in an African conflict? Sorry? No, I'm just, you ask me. Oh, really? Literally? Earthquakes again. Anyways, the point I was trying to make is that. Oh, gosh. Okay, no, we need to do things differently because clearly what we have been doing so far has not worked. Look at all the conflicts. When we get close to a settlement, the belligerent's first choice is confrontation. But there should be a price for those who choose confrontation. The lives of our people matter. We need to immediately get back to telling them, look, when the second thing that I think is important has to do with when you sign agreements and that we are guarantors, and that people violate these agreements when we are guarantors, what are the mechanisms we have in place to make the price so heavy that the last thing they will think about will be to violate these agreements? These are just some points on top of my mind that I'm thinking about, but we just need to do things differently because even countries which we thought were out of the woods, we are now seeing a relapse. Look at the Great Lakes. Look at the region here, near us. Look at the Sahel. The Sahel, things are, it's now affecting the coastal countries. So we need to do things differently. And we need to really, the resources are very few. We need to really work together with the resources that are available for peacemaking. That's what I can say. Sorry.
Ambassador, you want to say something? Yeah, please.
This is a little bit controversial because I'm an ambassador. So between ourselves here. So what am I saying? Preventative diplomacy. We have the APRM already. So we meet during the AU and they point out some of the weaknesses in terms of delivery of governments. But we hardly hear of any sanction. So I believe something like the APRM should have more teeth to be able to hold governments to account. We wouldn't just expel or suspend countries on the basis of constitutional changes of government, where governments are failing to deliver on their own agreements or in terms of services. I think there should be sanction. Those things are able to prevent future conflicts. So that's as far as I can say. So we should, as an AU, try to really give teeth to the APRM, not just to condemn or point out the misdeeds of government, but to be able to really sanction them. With that, somehow they'll be able to change their ways in terms of delivery to the citizenry. Thank you.
One, please.
I was saying, looking at the future of peacemaking, I think it's important for us to revisit the past and to learn from what has succeeded and what has failed. Because we can't even learn from stuff that failed, then we don't repeat the same mistakes. Now, there are two examples that come to my mind and in which I was involved, which I believe maybe should be revisited and can be helpful in the current context. Because the context is still the same. You have a commission that, well, is not without power, let's be frank. The commission has significant powers, contrary to what often people believe. The PAC is extremely powerful when you look at the powers. I think it's Article 8 or 7, I can't remember now. So but then obviously you're dealing with member states. And Ambassador, I take your point, but it's not easy to impose sanctions and they do not always work. But there are other ways of doing it, in my view. One thing we tried, which we did, and which was successful in my view, was the use of what I would call, this is just my own creation in terms of labeling it, what I would call framework communiques. It means when we face a situation that is as tricky as, let's say, the Great Lakes or Sudan or South Sudan, and mediation fails, what we did as Commission, with the help of the PAC, which we did hand in hand, was to lay down in a PAC communique what we believe is the solution in details. And then to say, because the PAC, of course, PAC communiques are binding on member states, to say this is the PAC decision on how the matter should be handled. Not only in general terms, in terms of saying we appeal, we urge, no, but we would say you should withdraw your forces by date A, we should meet by date X to agree, you should do A, B, C, D in a very detailed fashion. One communique that reflects that approach, which you can revisit, was a communique that was adopted by the Peace and Security Council in 2012, after the incident in Heglig, Sudan or South Sudan, depending on where the border was located. And then Sudan felt they were attacked and they wanted to write. And we had to scramble, working with the AU-HIP, AU High-Level Implementation Panel, then led by President Beki, to come up with that very strong communique with clear timelines on what needed to be done. Then we took it to the Security Council to get it endorsed. The council members, some were reluctant because the communique was, of course, I would say, well, it's not the type of communique that people would see as being driven by respect for sovereignty, because we were very specific. Some council members were reluctant to endorse the communique. And what we did, then it was Ping who was chairperson of the commission, Lamamra was Commission for Peace and Security. And I remember we were in Tunis. All of us, you were there. We invited you to a meeting of the panel of the wise. We came up with this idea, we write a letter from Ping to all the members of Security Council. Initially, we proposed to write only to those who were reluctant, but we did not want to single them out, and to say, this communique on Heglig is what we as Africans believe is the African solution to the current problem we're facing. So no one can challenge our communique on the ground that you know Africa or love Africa better than we do. And it put the reluctant council members on the back foot, and the council adopted that communique. In fact, it is the only Security Council resolution. They removed the title, AU, and the whole AU communique became resolution 2640. I'm not certain about the name. They copied, pasted on a UN paper, and it became the resolution. And what is the benefit of such communiques? You create a framework. You limit the room for maneuver for the parties. Of course, they can decide to violate it, but it comes with a political cost. When the entire continent of Africa and the Security Council have rallied behind a particular course of action, it limits your room for maneuver. And we managed in diffusing the tension. There was no conflict as such. We resolved some of the issues through the panel. In fact, they resolved a number of issues. Some, of course, remained outstanding. Another way of doing it was what was done in Côte d'Ivoire in 2011. 2011, yes. 10 March 2011. I remember the PAC committee, 10 March 2011. Again here, you remember, President Ouattara won the election, Gbagbo challenged, the Constitutional Council decided that Gbagbo won. AU was of a different view, but we took a different approach than ECOWAS. A high-level committee was put in place in January 2011 here in Addis. They met in committee room B of the old conference center. And that panel visited, worked for 3 months, and at the end came up with a report and a detailed communique on what needed to be done. And we said, this is the AU decision, point blank. It limited the room for maneuver for Gbagbo. He lost legitimacy, and it gave room to ONUC to be more proactive in the field to ensure that indeed the will of the people was respected. So I think AU, in my view, should try to explore the possibility of framework communiques where you lay down in details what needs to be done, parties may be unhappy, get it endorsed by Security Council, you limit the room for maneuver for the parties, and you engage from that standpoint. This is point, I think, one way, of looking at it. The second aspect, maybe you may wish to revisit. Again, based on our experience, look, as a commission, as powerful as the commission is, there are limits, because obviously, if I'm the chairperson or the commissioner, I can't fight with 10 or 15 member states. At any point in time, fight with 5 and get the support of 30. And they are not always the same. You always need a coalition of states behind you. Second, as a commission staff, there are limits as to what you can say, what you can do. Because at the end of the day, there are limits, let's be frank. Now, what we did was to put in place panels of former head of states, and we call them independent panel. That was the case of AUPD, AU panel Darfur. The PSC endorsed it, and independent panel means they can do whatever they want, and the chairperson has the deniability, space. Means when you see what the AU panel on Darfur, read that report, one of the best on Sudan, I would say the best on Sudan, which was issued in 2009 and endorsed by the PSC in Abuja in, October 2009 in Abuja, indeed. And they could say whatever they want, and they can do whatever they want in the field. And I have accompanied the panel in Darfur and in Sudan. And I remember, when we went the first time to Darfur, the local authorities, of course, don't want us to meet civil society. So they kept us busy with people who were in favor of the government all day. And me, as an officer, were very impatient. Why isn't President Beki being outspoken? But of course, he has far more experience than we do. So when we came back, President Beki requested a meeting with then Vice President Taha. And he told him, listen, we are here to help. But if you want us to help, you have to be serious and you have to allow us to do our job. So you have to let us know, are you willing to let us work or not? And from that day on, the panel met with whoever it wanted to meet with. Now, if you are in a commission, it's difficult to have that type of conversation. But if you can hide behind a panel of former head of state that are deemed to be independent, you have that possibility. It multiplies the impact of the commission. I think that is an important point. Maybe the commission may wish to revisit. Last point on prevention. Again, prevention is about presence. You have to be there. And I'm glad that AU has a number of liaison offices. They need to be reinforced. They need to be better resourced, clearly. But presence means you have to be in those countries all the time. You have to engage systematically. It's not you come one day, you come back 6 months later. No, literally you have to be there every 2 weeks, every month to speak to people. Because I believe people have common sense, but they need to be spoken with. It means what? You need to have as many invoices as you can. It's much cheaper than the peacekeeping missions. They have to travel, they have to be given resources. It's cheap to do that, to engage, to go to countries literally on a weekly basis. That's how you grab information. That's how you are aware of what's going on. That's how you can alert. That's how you can speak to leaders confidentially to advise. And I believe it can work. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think all that is left, earlier somebody was saying, for example, in the context of Somalia, is it too bad? Now we are exploring different options. Is it too bad to contemplate the Taliban option in Somalia? Is it something that we need to work towards too, as one possibility, and therefore what needs to happen in that respect? I think from the discussions that we have had so far, I don't even try to attempt to summarize. But we have been told that we need really to be mindful of the current geopolitical and global context in which we are discussing about the future of peacekeeping, in which we are discussing about the Peacebuilding Architecture review. And this same mindfulness vis-a-vis the global context needs to inform our engagement on the AU-UN partnership on peace and security, which covers both the peacekeeping and the peace-building dimension of the equation. And we have also been informed about the imperative for being pragmatic and practical about our thinking about the current situation, globally speaking, but also in terms of what can happen and what can be done meaningfully and concretely on the ground. These, I think, are important points of departure. The question of financing has been raised, whether or not, for example, we will have any resolution as far as financing goes from the Berlin Ministerial. I'm not really sure, but that is something that the Berlin Ministerial, obviously, one of the major issues that it needs also to wrestle with and address in the light of the major shifts that are happening. It's important in all of these discussions, whether in relation to the AU-UN partnership, whether in terms of the future of peacekeeping or the peacekeeping, the peacebuilding architecture review, Africa is at the heart of all of these conversations, because this is where many of the large number of peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping operations are currently underway and have been in previous years. And this has also been where some of the most interesting innovations and creativity in terms of UN peacekeeping have been established. Similarly, the large number of cases for the peacebuilding commission's interventions have been from the African continent again. And therefore, we have to bear in mind the fact that Africa is not just a site for conflict, but it is also a hub of solutions and innovations, to quote Ambassador Harold. With that, all that I'm going to say is to build on the entry that Ambassador Fred gave me in making reference to Amani Africa's work. So he was referring to the special research report that we did, reviewing the 10-year journey of the African Union with respect to its project on silencing the guns. It is titled Memo to the New African Union Commission Leadership from the Roaring Guns on African Union's first decade of silencing the guns. This is also where we said the approach, the business as usual approach of the AU has failed, and there is a need for change. And that change includes what Fred talked about and what Juan talked about. Actually, we said we need to go back to the good old days of the African Union. That is what we said in the report. And the other one, of course, is our annual review of the year 2024, titled Africa in a New Era of Insecurity and Instability, the 2024 review of the Peace and Security Council, basically really highlighting not only that the situation on the continent has become very worrisome, but also how we are engaging at the African Union needs a complete rethink. And that goes back to the point that have been made by all the speakers over the course of the day. I would like to join me in thanking the members of this panel for an excellent job done in providing us with rich insights and perspectives on the theme of this session. Thank you very much to all of them. I also would like to thank my colleagues in Amani Africa, without whom we wouldn't have been able to have this rich day-long conference. Thank you to Tafsat, Fikr, Yaruk, Robel, Priven, Sisai, Brooke, all of you, really very grateful for your contributions. I also wish to thank the Embassy of Canada, Permanent Mission of Canada, to the African Union for the support that made the convening of this event possible. We are very grateful. I also wish to acknowledge with deep appreciation our other partners whose support is critical for everything that we do at Amani Africa. The Embassy of Ireland, the Embassy of Switzerland, and the Embassy of Norway. Thank you very much for your support. After spending all day with us, we will not say to you goodbye empty-handed. So we have a cocktail reception outside for us to just freshen ourselves up and also unwind. So we invite you, please, to join us just outside for this cocktail for freshening us up. Thank you all very much again. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ambassador, for joining us, for being with us online all day long.
Thank you,
Very
brother.
grateful.
It's a great
You
pleasure, my
intervene.
brother. Benefited
Thank
a
you
lot.
so much.
Very valuable. Thanks a
Next
lot.
time we will have you in person here in Addis.
It will
We
be
look
an honor.
forward to it.
It will be an honor,
Thank you.
man. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Have a good day. Thank you, Ambassador.
Bye-bye. Goodbye.